Hey, so I wanted to, so firstly, thanks to everybody who's supporting my Patreon, people who got back to me about like doing a little bit of video content for, like answering questions by way of video stuff, first to my Patreon backers and then to like everybody else. Um, Somebody was asking me about exposure. It was kind of a long-winded question. I'm going to narrow it down to like it's something about like exposure in the work that I'm doing and everything. Um, so Ava DuVernay, like the Golden Globes were like this weekend. The Golden Globes were like yesterday or the day before. I don't remember exactly which. I don't really watch the award shows, but Ava DuVernay, filmmaker, was on Twitter with a picture of Brad Pitt and Robert De Niro, and she was talking about how the two of them gave her some really big opportunities. Where like I think it was like Brad Pitt helped. He executive produced and helped Selma get made, and excuse me, and Robert De Niro executive produced and helped When They See Us get made. And like I read through some of the comments on Twitter, and people were saying how like Brad Pitt actually helped a lot of shit get made, like 12 Years a Slave and Moonlight and If Beale Street Could Talk and a bunch of other shit. And like that's sort of how exposure works when you have platforming, where like people with big platforms, people with big bank, people with big reach can help people get spotlighted who weren't otherwise going to get spotlighted. I could go into talking about like Forrest Whitaker and Danny Glover and those guys helping launch the career of Ryan Coogler, but like also like Ryan Coogler and Chadwick Boseman, but like those are black guys helping other black guys, and like that's like that should be a common thing. When I mean like people with bigger platforms, like white folks who have bigger reach, who get like credibility by way of being white folks, like this unearned credibility that white folks often get. And like I sort of have a unique viewpoint on how exposure works and how it doesn't. Like, so I put out the book Love's Not Colorblind, and Love's Not Colorblind is the only book that's covering how race and polyamory interact. That's it. That's the book. It's only the one. So like if somebody's like, hey, I'm looking to get into polyamory, you can say like, well, I can suggest The Ethical Slut to you, or Opening Up, or More Than Two, or like any number of books that cover the topic of getting into polyamory. But like when you're talking about like how race and representation function within polyamorous circles, there's just one book. So I get this unique viewpoint because a lot of times I find myself left out of conversations or not being shouted out when like there's only a singular viewpoint. Like, for example, a friend of mine hit me up recently and said like, hey Kev, I was on such and such a podcast and they asked about book suggestions, and I brought up your book, and I was really happy to give you that exposure. And I'm like, yo, thank you, I appreciate that. I listen to a lot of podcasts. Like I listen to podcasts while I work, I listen to them while I drive from exercising, I listen to them then. So I go in, I find this podcast, and I download not only the episode where my friend appeared, but like another recent episode that was like a resource. Like it was the host running down a list of resources, and my name doesn't come up. And it's like, all right, well, it's not just like me being big-headed about my work. Like there's a point where they bring up the idea of people thinking that polyamory is like for like white, affluent, educated, so on, like the points of mass representation. And then they don't bring me up. And I'm like, this is an episode strictly about supplying resources. They're naming book after book after book after book, and then they get to my topic, of which there is only one book in existence, and I don't get mentioned. I'm like, alright, cool. I see what's going on here. Okay. It actually happened in another podcast where, like, I'm listening to a podcast, one that I listen to on a regular basis, And we get to a point where they're talking about like how to expand your horizons in terms of inclusivity. Like, it's not just trying to make a black friend. Like, a lot of that is, trying to find other resources, like diversifying your media intake. And so they're talking about that. They're like, instead of just reading like the same 5 sci-fi novels by the same, cishet white dudes that people tell you are the classics, branch out, find some other people, find some women, find some people of color, find some queer and trans authors, and bring that in and see how it changes your perspective on all of these things. And I'm like, yo, cool. What are the examples? And they didn't give a lot of examples. And then eventually they sort of wade into the same topic of representation and, racial dating preferences and a few other topics that were all stuff that like I've covered in my book, and also that I've covered on that podcast in particular, because I had been on there talking about my book. And I'm like, all right, but like they have to mention me a couple of times, and like, not me. I'm not talking about me. Fuck Kev. I mean, talking about like Love's Not Colorblind. They have to mention Love's Not Colorblind because they're talking about topics that I brought up on this podcast, topics that I cover in specifically on in my book and on this podcast. Like, they're talking about my shit, but they're not mentioning me. They're not mentioning my work, and like, I'm not going to mention like the names of these podcasts because like it's not really important. It's not like I'm trying to call anybody out or call anybody in or make an example of anybody. I'm just saying that like the point is, the way this exposure works is you have to like make conscious decisions about like the kind of media that you're taking in. You have to make conscious decisions on how you're going to use your platform. Even if your platform is just your friend group, some people online, your online gaming buddies, like you have to make conscious decisions on what that looks like, because it's literally the difference between like people showing up and not showing up. It's the reason why and again, like, it's, black folks helping black folks, that's a thing that happens all the time, but like it's the reason why I do as much as I do. Like, I put a lot of, like, I designate part of my budget, part of my paycheck for my muggle job. Like, my my polyamorous shit doesn't bring in a lot of money, but like my muggle job brings in a fair enough amount of money that I'm able to budget helping other people's projects. Whenever I'm on podcasts, wherever applicable, I try to shout people out. Like, I'm gonna do that right now, where Jaminica Eborn has a really wonderful project called Trauma Queen, and that's a podcast. But she's also doing like this retreat for women of color, or like for women of color or femmes of color. I don't remember exact details, but it's for people who have experienced like sexual trauma. It's a retreat for people to sort of like recoup, recover, have network, and so on. And it's an amazing project. Cameron Glover does sex ed in color and does like seminars about like how to be a sex educator in like in spaces that are typically very white. Like how to be yourself, how to do your thing, how to monetize your project in spaces that aren't always going to be welcoming to you. I think it's Dirty Lola, and I think it's Francisco Ramirez, Francisco something. Don't quote me on Francisco, but like Dirty Lola has a project. She does Sex at a Go-Go, which is a edutainment / burlesque comedy sex ed show that she does like every month, and like she does like a video series, a sex ed video series. Like, there's a lot of people doing a lot of really good work. Afrosexology does amazing work out of St. Louis. I'm gonna try to put like links to all of this stuff because like my memory is what it is, but like links are forever. So I'm gonna try to plug all that stuff in there underneath this. And you can find me, obviously you can find me right here because this is like a YouTube video, but like you can find me. I'm Poly Role Models on Twitter. I'm Poly Role Models on Facebook and Instagram and Patreon. I'm gonna keep doing video content like this, answering people's questions, and doing like early for Patreon backers, and then like eventually for everybody else. And so yeah, that's where you can find me, and that's what I'm doing. And thanks for taking your time for watching this thing of me rambling around. Later.